Welcome back. It is the Brett Winterble Show, right here on NewsmaxTV. The Inquisition. What is this? The Inquisition? The Inquisition. You hear that term thrown around all the time, right? I've even heard it thrown around in the context of the modern political environment. Brett Kavanaugh testifying last summer. Bill Barr's at the Congress this past week. You hear it all the time. This is like the Inquisition. Well, what is the Inquisition? And what's the practical implications of the Inquisition for today? And I can think of nobody better to bring on than our very good friend from the Archdiocese of San Francisco, California, up the road from me. Father Bill Nicholas joins us. Father Bill, thanks for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me on, Brett. It's good to be with you again.
So tell me of this Inquisition. Sometimes you see it in history books. You never really get a good reading or an understanding of what it is. Everybody seems to think they know what it is, and they throw it around as some sort of invective. Help us understand the Inquisition.
Well, the Inquisition, well, first of all, it's part of a department of the Vatican that today is called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. If they're going to be teachers of Catholic faith, it needs to be authentic, it needs to be true. There's a meme going around that I've noticed. It's quite amusing. It basically says, you have a right to believe whatever you want. However, you don't have a right to believe whatever you want and call it Catholic. And basically, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith ensures authentic Catholic teaching. And now where the Inquisition is concerned in history, it came at a time after there was a great rivalry between the church and the nobility, the ruling class, the Holy Roman Emperor, the kings and the nobles at the time, as to who had authority to appoint bishops and even appoint the Pope. And when that was resolved, because if you remember, King Henry II actually appointed Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury. But eventually it was solidified that it was the church, a group of bishops called the College of Cardinals, who would appoint the Pope. And the Holy See would appoint bishops. Bishops would appoint their priests, and that the local lords and nobles didn't have a say in this. Well, if you were a lord or a noble who had a bishop who was perhaps a rival, someone you didn't appoint, who was perhaps opposing you or critical of you, as Thomas Becket eventually was of King Henry II, then how do you get rid of some of these guys? You didn't appoint them. You don't have that authority. So it was popular to accuse them or a priest or perhaps even other political rivals of being a communist. I'm sorry, communist, being a heretic. And of course, you know, you could whip up the frenzy of the population and perhaps lead to their arrest, their imprisonment, and perhaps even their execution. But when it came to such things as church teaching, the church would come in and say, not so fast. You don't have the authority to determine erroneous church teaching or heresy. And so what the Inquisition did was it provided a process whereby these accusations would be examined, and it basically was developed to prevent anarchy and mass lynch law of accused heretics. And the Inquisition would come in and give what would call a period of grace, maybe like 30 days or so, to call all those accused of heresy to come forth and either recant, repent, and take on authentic church teaching, or, when necessary, their teachings would be examined by the Inquisition. And if it was found to be erroneous or heretical, they would give them the chance to, again, recant, repent, realize their error, and reaffirm authentic church teaching, whereupon they would simply say, well, sorry, my lord or your majesty, they've recanted, they're back on board, and they're staying in their position. Or they'd examine their teaching and realize, no, they were not. And, well, sorry, my lord, your majesty, we're not going to depose them because they are of authentic church teaching. On rare occasions, when they were found to be in error and were very stubborn, would the church then turn them over to the secular arm. And executions, while it happened, were very rare. But in many ways, the Inquisition, as we know it as a trial system, really was brought into a time in which the lords and monarchs had absolute power over life and death. It brought in something we call due process, examination of evidence. And was it perfect? No, of course not. Nothing ever is at its in the outset. Were there abuses? Of course there were. And what was torture used? Everyone used torture at that time, even the lords and the monarchs in their interrogation procedures. But the church had a strict code that you did not risk life and limb, and all evidence from torture had to be verified by other evidence. And such notorious inquisitors as, say, Bernardo Gui had little use for torture. But in many ways, it brought a sense of order to the chaos and due process to what could have descended into mass lynch law, because the best way to get rid of someone, a political rival or a bishop you didn't appoint and was a thorn in your side, was to accuse them of heresy. But the church came in and gave them a process of examination of their teachings and came to a decision based on that examination.
So I mean, according to the Judeo-Christian tradition, right, starting with the laws of Moses up through the time of the Christian church, there have been rules of the road. There have been rules. There have been procedures. There have been processes that have been put into place. They go back. This goes back 5,000 years. I mean, in terms of the way things have been managed. Why is it like such a boogeyman now in this modern age? They look at the church, the Inquisition. That's obviously means the church is corrupt. Everything's corrupt. Where does that boogeyman come from, Father?
Well, you got to also look at where it comes from, and especially with the monotonous Spanish Inquisition, that ominous Spanish Inquisition that everyone loves to refer to. Even Edgar Allan Poe's Pit and the Pendulum is set in the midst of the Spanish Inquisition. You got to consider the rivalry between Catholicism and Protestantism at the time, but also the rivalry between faith and the Enlightenment. Believe it or not, Thomas Hobbes, who was one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, and another one, Jean Bodin, in their writings would say witches need to be rooted out and burned in the slowest possible fires. Thomas Hobbes declared witches are rightly executed. And these were philosophers of the Enlightenment. In fact, the hunting of witches was at its height during the Enlightenment, but also the rivalry between Catholic Spain and Protestant England, which was a terrible rivalry that went even to the point of war on many cases. The propaganda between the two, and especially on the English side, would vilify not only Spain, but the Catholicism of Spain. But even in the Spanish Inquisition, there was an occasion, I believe it is in 1610 in Logroño, in which 6 people were executed for witchcraft, and the supreme authority of the Inquisition, called La Suprema, came in to examine the situation, interview witnesses, and actually put a stop to that practice. It brought, again, a sense of law and order to the practice. It actually paid reparations to the victims of that abuse of the local Inquisition. And it exonerated over 1,800 people accused of witchcraft. And believe it or not, in its examination of the whole situation, it declared that the best way to deal with the crisis of witchcraft is to stop preaching about it and writing about it. And one of the inquisitors wrote, he said, there was no problem with the witches or the bewitched until it was talked about and written about. And so they basically said, you don't want to whip people into a frenzy? Stop talking about it. And that's one example in the Spanish Inquisition, where the Inquisition came in and kept it from descending into anarchy and chaos. And because of the process, exonerated people accused, paid reparations to victims of abuse, and kind of tempered the attitude that, the best way to deal with some of these crises, such as witchcraft, even is to stop talking about it, to stop whipping people into that frenzy.
And we would later see, obviously, the Salem witch trials in the English colonies in Massachusetts. We would eventually see witch hunts of various sorts up until this modern day. Father Bill Nicholas, a tremendous explanation of this process. I think you've given everybody a lot of historical and religious context here. We so appreciate you making time for us today. Thanks so much for coming by, and we look forward to our next visit.
Thanks for having me, Brett. Good to see you again.